Today we are covering section 6.2. It's all about properties of parallelograms. So our objective today is to use the properties of parallelograms. This is very closely related to what we're going to do tomorrow. So 6.3 is a lot like 6.2. Then we're going to take a little break. We're going to spend a couple days reviewing, and then you will have a quiz on Tuesday. Do you guys have any questions before we get going? Alright, here is some vocab for you. So the first thing we want to talk about is what it means to be a parallelogram. And then there are 4 properties of parallelograms. We are going to draw on these parallelograms down here. So if you want to put 3 parallelograms in your notes and then just wait, we'll fill these in a second. But I'll give you a few minutes to get all this down. Then we'll label those diagrams a little bit, and then we have 8 examples for today. Alright, so the first thing we need to talk about is, well, what is a parallelogram? So a parallelogram is a quadrilateral. How many sides do quadrilaterals have? 4. Okay, so these are figures with 4 sides, and both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. So do you remember how we mark something as parallel? They have these little like arrow things on them. So anytime you see those, and then usually it's like 2 arrows going the other way, that means you have a parallelogram. Okay? Now, a few really cool things happen in parallelograms. The first one is that the opposite sides are always congruent. So whatever this side is, this side will be the same. They're congruent. This one is going to be congruent to that one. So the sides opposite one another are congruent. Okay? Now, another cool thing is the angles opposite each other are congruent. So whatever this angle is, the other angle across from it is the same. And then this one is the same as this one. So lots going on in that first parallelogram. Main things to remember: the sides are parallel that are opposite one another. They're also congruent. So if this one is 4, this one's 4. If this one's 100, this one's 100. If this one's 95, this one's 95. They're always the exact same thing. Same for the angles. These angles are going to be the same, and these angles are going to be the same. Alright, so that's the first 2 properties and the definition all covered in one diagram. Then the third one says that the consecutive angles are supplementary. What does it mean to be supplementary? They add to 180. Good. So I could give you any one of the angles and you could find all the rest of them. Let's say this one's 80. What adds to 80 to get 180? 100. So all the angles that are touching that angle, all the ones that are right next to it, are 100. Okay? And then if this is 100, then what would have to go here to add to 180? 80. So once you know one, you know all of them, because the consecutive angles, the ones right next to each other, add up to give you 180. The last property that we'll learn is property number 4. It says that the diagonals, so draw some diagonals on here, bisect each other. To bisect means to cut in half. So this side's going to be the same as this side. This side's going to be the same as this side. So if you can remember these 4 properties, you will do wonderfully today. All of the examples relate back to one or more of these properties. Do you guys have any questions? Alright, now there's actually 2 ways you can answer this. If you want to write off to the side like DA equals, DC equals, that's fine. Or if you want to make it a little simpler on yourself, you can just label it within the diagram. So, what do I know about opposite sides? It was the first property you wrote down on the last slide. They're congruent. So if CB is 14, what's DA? 14. Now circle it so we know that that's your answer, not just something you're doodling. All right, if AB is 7, what's DC? 7, very good. So opposite sides are congruent. Do you have any questions? All right, you don't need to write this one down. You can just watch. I think one of each type is enough for your notes, but I do want to continue practicing a little bit. So just out loud, let's see if we can find the measure of DA. What is it? DA is 1.25. It's the same as the side across from it. These are congruent. What about DC? 0.75. It's the same as the side across. What questions do you have? All right, I do want you to get number 3 in your notes because it's a little different. So I'll give you a second to draw this one. We actually have 3 answers here. So again, if you want to write off to the side like the measure of angle P equals the measure of angle Q equals the measure of angle R equals, that's fine. Or you can just label it within the diagram and that will be enough information for me. All right, now one of these angles we know right away without doing much work. Which one is it? We know S, right? Which other one do we know like right away? Q. Right? The angles across from each other, the angles opposite, are the same. So what is the measure of angle Q? 144. Good. Now, I'm going to have to do a little bit more math to find angle P and angle R. Does anyone remember the property that talks about angles that are right next to each other? Consecutive angles are, I think it was the third property you wrote down. Consecutive angles are supplementary. Supplementary angles add to 180 degrees. So if I can do 180 minus 144, that'll give me the measure of angle R since they're right next to each other. What is that measure? 36. There's not much space in there, but you can draw a little angle, so that's 36 degrees. Again, circle your answers just so your homework's a little easier to grade. So if R is 36, what's the angle across from R? 36, so you can find angle P right away. They're the same. And then there's a few ways you can double check these. All angles opposite are congruent, so 144, 144, 36 and 36. And then every combination of angles next to each other should add to 180. These add to 180, these add to 180, these add to 180, these add to 180. So you can go like sort of around the parallelogram and make sure that it all makes sense. And it does in this case. Questions? All right, here's another one just for a little extra practice. You don't need to spend a bunch of time writing it down. You can just watch and listen. Follow along. Which one do you know right away? R. What is R? 87. Good. That one's like a no-brainer. Done. But I still need Q and S. How am I going to find Q and S? What do I know about angles that are right next to each other? They add to 180. So if I do 180 minus 87, that gives me 93. That means that angle Q is 93. What other angle is 93? S, very good. So again, angles opposite one another are the same. Angles next to each other add to 180. So add to 180, add to 180, add to 180, add to 180. All right, the fourth property that you wrote down was all about the diagonals. What do the diagonals do to one another? They bisect. So this diagonal cuts CE in half. This diagonal cuts FD in half. I am looking for GE. GE should be the same as CG since it's been bisected. So what is GE? 6.2. Good. What is DF? Where's D? Oh, DF is the big one. So how long is DF? What's the measure of DF? This one's kind of tricky. I'm going to write it off to the side. So DF is this long thing right here. I only know half of it. If half of it's 8.2, what's the whole thing? Well, FG is 8.2. But what's the whole thing from F to D? What should I do with the measure of these two segments to find the whole thing? Add them together, so that would be 16.4. So you got to pay attention to what they're asking you for. Sometimes they ask you for the whole thing. Sometimes they just ask you for the other half. Sometimes they give you the whole thing and they ask you for one of the halves. So just keep making sure you're reading the directions. But again, double check that these are the same. These are the same. Any questions? Again, you already have one of these in your notes, so if you want to just sit back and watch on this one, that would be fine. Here we have GE that we're looking for, and we're given the entire length of that diagonal CE. So if the whole thing is 22, what's just this little guy? It would be half of 22, right? Yeah. What's half of 22? 11. So that one's 11. Again, if you can fit it right in the diagram, that's fine. If you want to write it off to the side, that's fine too. And then the other one we're looking for is GF. GF is the same as GD since FD was bisected. So what is this one? 9. Same as the other one. Good. So again, depends what you're given and depends what you're looking for. What are your questions? All right, here's the next one I want you to write in your notes. Alright, so we are actually looking for two things now. We're looking for X and we're looking for Y. Do you guys feel like you know one of them right away? Someone said, Which one? Y. Y is what? 131. So if you know it right away without solving an equation, just tell me what the answer is. Y is 131 because opposite angles are congruent. Alright, we need to do a little bit more to find X. I know if I take X and I add 131 to it, what should I get? What should two consecutive angles add to? 180. So you can set up this equation and solve for the X by subtracting 131 from 180. What does that give you? 49? Good. Questions? Alright, now this last one is a little different. I'm going to give you the option to write it in your notes if you want. You're not required to, but it might be nice just to have it. But what do I know about opposite sides of a parallelogram? Opposite sides are the same. Okay, so if you want to label them the same, you can, just to remind yourself what you're going to do. Or you can start setting up equations. So 5y minus 3 should equal what? 12, because these have to be congruent. So that's one equation we're going to solve. What's the other equation we're going to solve?
2x plus 1 equals 5.
Very good. So we are using our knowledge about opposite sides being congruent to set up two different equations. Once you've set them up, you can solve them, or you can solve them one by one as you go. It's really up to you. I like setting it all up first, then going back. But to solve this, I need to add 3 to both sides. That gives me 5y equals 15. So what's y going to be? 3. So that's half the battle. Finding y. Now we got to find x. Oh, careful, you got to subtract the 1. So that's a 4. It's 2, yep. Good. Right, yeah, you got to do the opposite, so. Common mistake. Alright, that is everything you need to know for 6.2 on parallelograms. What are your questions?